The scope and nature of distant reading. Franco Moretti's idea of distant reading is an interesting one. He claims that we should stop reading just because distant reading widens our scope of knowledge and allows us to take into account all literature, rather than just a select few that get rehashed over and over again in every English class. An example of one of Moretti's discoveries through distant reading is that from approximately 1700 to 1900, a total of 44 genres cycled through, in clusters of about 6 genres at a time. Well, although the idea of distant reading is certainly novel and intriguing, we should be careful of any claims that distant reading can replace close reading, or is better than close reading in any way, because by cross-examining Lydia Davis's short story collection, Break It Down, by using distant and close reading, it's clear that distant reading fails to take into account many important factors, such as context and weight, when analyzing text, and thus fails to accurately quantify literature. Current technology can very quickly and reliably count up things like average sentence length, number of words, and most frequently used words in the text, the more grammatical aspects of literature. And as Moretti's genre example previously illustrated, this could have historical significance, which is great. But there's so much that distant reading can't do. It fails to account for the subtleties of writing. It can't produce reliable data for the more content-related and advanced aspects of literature, such as author's tone and purpose, satire and sarcasm, and context and weight. And these things are important to consider, because they can change the meaning of a word, paragraph, or even an entire text. For example, one sentiment analysis tool rates a text as positive, negative, or neutral based on the frequency of positive or negative words. Running each short story and break it down through this tool, I found that the collection as a whole was mainly negative, a finding that I strongly agreed with. After careful inspection of the results, however, I realized that the tool could not take context into account. For example, the tool considered groan a negative word, but anyone who's actually read Mildred and the Oboe would agree that groan in that context was meant to convey pleasure and thus not necessarily a negative word. This is the first instance in which distant reading fails to correctly quantify literature. Next, I found that it was near impossible to determine the themes of Break It Down through distant reading alone. Text analysis tools such as this word count would have you believe that time is the major theme in Break It Down. But it's not. The word time in Break It Down is simply used as a sort of preposition, as in every time or for some time. It is actually themes like heartbreak, rejection, and failure that are at the heart of Break It Down. Yet none of these words, nor any of their synonyms, appear frequently in the text. In fact, the 5 most common words in Break It Down are time, like, house, day, and man. These are rather mundane words that don't truly have anything to do with the issues at the heart of Break It Down. This second failure of text analysis shows, once again, that context is very important to text analysis and that, as of now, distant reading is unable to take context into account. Finally, distant reading practices fail to consider the weight of certain ideas or words. For example, one can safely argue that Break It Down, the short story, is one of the most important short stories in the entire collection because it has the same title as the collection itself. Break It Down, a 2,932-word short story, is certainly more important than a story such as Fish, another short story in the collection that is only 118 words long. But when you feed the collection through any text analysis tool, it will weigh everything at the same value, when perhaps some should be considered weightier than others. If that's not convincing enough, let us return to the example of themes and Break It Down. One of the major themes is love, yet the word love appears only 39 times in the text, compared to time, which appears a total of 113 times, nearly 3 times as much. But love is certainly a more significant word in Break It Down than time is, and thus distant reading practices once again produce misleading data because it fails to take the weight of certain ideas into account. The results of cross-examining Break It Down make it clear that distant reading fails to analyze text the way close reading does, and fails to accurately represent the big ideas of a text. So does this mean that distant reading is absolutely useless? Of course not. For example, you can use distant reading tools to find that the average sentence length and break it down is a little over 20 words, and you have now discovered something new about Davis's writing style. This information is certainly something more suited to distant reading rather than close reading, and illustrates further that the two are separate practices and should be recognized as such. Thus, although distant reading is useful in its own way, it should not claim to replace close reading, nor should it claim to have a wider scope than that of close reading. That would be like exchanging a microscope with a camera and claiming that the camera does a better job than the microscope, when in reality they were never meant to perform the same tasks. After all, when you zoom out you lose detail, and when you zoom in you lose the big picture. It is simply in the nature of distant reading to lose the specifics of each text, and it is in the nature of writing to include subtleties that cannot be grasped by distant reading, that cannot be neatly converted into the hard lines of charts and graphs. Ironically enough, Break It Down's titular short story is all about a man attempting to quantify his love affair by breaking down the price to the experience in order to determine whether he paid a reasonable price or not. He attempts this by dividing the amount of time he spent with the girl by the total amount of money he paid. By the end, however, by considering the impact of both the pleasure and pain he experienced, it is clear that there is no clear-cut way to quantify his experiences. Likewise, perhaps we should realize that some things have more subjective and emotional significance that numbers can't convey.